Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. There's a large audience this morning, not just from the courses at the University of Limerick here, but thanks to everybody from outside the university who's joined with an interest in the speaker and the talk this morning. So this is part of the Sport and Human Performance Research Lecture Series. The Centre was launched in October 2022, and it's an interdisciplinary centre for internal and external researchers brought together in the discipline of sport and human performance. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Cormac Powell, who joins this morning. Particularly delighted to welcome back a graduate from our courses in PES and University of Limerick. My own name is Ian Kenny. For those who don't know me, I'm the co-director for the centre. Look after the lecture series and other aspects of the centre as well. So just as a brief bio before we get started, Dr. Cormac Powell is part of the Sport Ireland High Performance Unit, which aims to support the achievement of a number of objectives, and primarily delivery of systemic and sustained success at European, World, Olympic and Paralympic level. As the High Performance System Evaluation Manager, Dr. Powell manages the systematic approach to researching, monitoring and evaluation of high performance sport. And Cormac has a PhD in physical activity and cardiometabolic health from the University of Limerick. And he also held a post-doctoral position in the department here, where he was project manager for a large all-Ireland physical activity surveillance study. Cormac was previously associate head of performance services with Swim Ireland, with responsibility for overseeing the national swimmers in the sports science, sports medicine interventions and projects. And they were in disciplines across physiology, performance analysis, biomechanics, lifestyle, and psychology. So this morning, Cormac will discuss his current role at Sport Ireland, but also a lot of what was previous in his role in Swim Ireland. That's practical applications of athlete monitoring. It'll be for about 40 minutes or so, Cormac, with plenty of time for questions for those who want to pose them. And feel free during the talk just to put anything into the chat. Okay, so I'll hand over to Cormac. Thanks for joining us.
Cheers. Thanks, Ian, and for the warm introduction, and also for the invitation to come and talk to the group today. I'm just going to share my screen initially.
That's good. I can see that.
Perfect. Just let this play. Yeah, so I'm going to jump straight in. As Ian said, the whole premise of the talk is centered around practical applications of athlete monitoring. But just by way of a bio, and Ian has covered a lot of my highlights, none of the lowlights, of how I've come to the position I currently hold. But just for a little bit of a recap, so I am a graduate of the University of Limerick. I was part of the Sport and Exercise Science program that graduated in 2013. And then as part of that program, I undertook my particular placement. So for those of you who maybe aren't aware, Sports Science program has a placement opportunity in second semester of third year. So I ended up going to the Cardiff School of Sport and Health Sciences, which is based in Cardiff Metropolitan University. At the time, it was known as UWIC, which was University of Wales in Cardiff. So they have since changed names, but the premise of the school itself remains the same. And while I was there, I worked under John Oliver. So I was based in the physiology and health department, and it was probably my first introduction. Maybe not first introduction, but it was definitely an opportunity for me to hone my skills, or my practical skills around monitoring and assessments. So while I was there, John had set up a number of projects for me to run, and it gave me some really good practical experience in monitoring and evaluation. When I returned from my final year to UL, I then applied for a scholarship to undertake a PhD, and that was under the tutelage of Alan Donnelly and Brian Carson. Graduated from that in 2017, and as Ian has already alluded to, I then undertook a post-doctoral position in the department as well. From a high performance sport perspective, I have been fortunate enough to have been involved in a number of different capacities along the continuum of performance sport. from grassroots level up to high performance level. So my initial exposure was as the head coach of my previous swimming club. So I took that position up in 2012 and ultimately held it for 5 years. And that was very much part of my formative years around what it's like to work in sport. For those of you who have experience working at grassroots level, you end up catering for quite a variety of athletes. The program that we ran in that club catered for regional swimmers, but also those up towards junior and senior international level as well. While I was doing my PhD, I had the opportunity to work in one of Swim Ireland's 2 national centres at the time. So those of you who may not be familiar with the setup in UL, Swim Ireland have a national centre housed in the UL Sport Arena. So I took that position up in 2014, and I actually held 2 positions while I was there. One was the associate coach, and the other one was the performance scientist. So the performance scientist really got me into working directly with high performance athletes in terms of monitoring and evaluating certain metrics over time. That group was a little bit of a higher caliber than the club coaching I had experienced previous, because there were Olympians in that group, some who had competed in London, others who were aspiring for Rio in 2016. And I had the opportunity to travel to Hong Kong while I was in that centre to attend the FINA World Cup, the open water races. So again, gave me some very good first-hand and practical experience of working with athletes in that environment. I then was fortunate to essentially be headhunted for a position within Swim Ireland. So it was halfway through the Tokyo cycle at this stage, so it was 2018, where they were looking to hire an associate head of performance services, and applied is the title at the end in brackets, because there was a second associate head of performance services hired at the same time as well. So our collective remit was around sports science and sports medicine, but we had different areas of focus. And then within that focus, we were ultimately catering for 2 disciplines, so swimming and diving, 2 centres, centre in Dublin, centre in Limerick. At the time, there were 3 national squads, so the performance squad being those who were tracking towards Tokyo, the performance transition squad who were tracking towards Paris, and then the performance pathway squad who were ultimately tracking towards LA. And then attached to that then were the national teams at both junior and senior level. While I was part of the performance team at Swim Ireland, I was team member on 2 international competitions. One was the World Long Course Championships in Guangzhou, and then later that year was the European Short Course Championships in Glasgow. And again, that gave me some very good insights and practical experience in terms of monitoring athletes leading into competition, but then also monitoring them while we were at competition as well. I left my position with Swim Ireland in 2021, so just after the Olympic trials, to take the position I now currently have, which is the High Performance System Evaluation Manager. So that sits within the High Performance Unit of Sport Ireland. And the High Performance Unit has a very simple mandate, and that's to assist our national governing bodies in the delivery of their high performance programs. Those high performance programs are ultimately aiming to have success at European, World, Olympic and Paralympic levels. So be it making semi-finals, finals, and ultimately medal success at those different competition levels. Within the high performance system and structure in Ireland, we do have a high performance strategy. It was released in 2021 and it runs up until 2032. And what the high performance strategy does is it lays out our long-term plan in terms of what we want the Irish performance system to do over the next 3 Olympic and Paralympic cycles. So we've had Tokyo already. You will know that it's Tokyo 2020, even though it happened in 2021. And then it lays out specific medal targets for Paris and LA. The end of the strategy coincides with the Brisbane Games, but targets for that haven't been laid out yet because that's such a distance away that it would be a little bit remiss to try and make targets for that now without seeing how Paris and LA progress first. And the targets for those games, particularly the end point of LA 2028, they are ambitious. So we want 8 to 10 Olympic medals and then 12 to 16 Paralympic medals. And that's where my position becomes quite important. In terms of what I have to do, as the name suggests, there is an evaluation of the high performance programs. Some of that is done on a yearly basis, be it through mid-year reviews, end-year reviews, and some of those things are linked to talent pathways, coaching structures, but then broader issues such as governance, finance. So you're looking at the entire collective when it comes to evaluating a high performance program. The end of each Olympic and Paralympic cycle will culminate with a review. For Paris, it'll end up being 2 reviews. One will be a review of the games, so that's how Team Ireland performed, but then a more broad review, which is centered around the system itself. So reviewing how that cycle has gone, it's where we can identify key learnings to help the following cycle so that we can ultimately end up in LA 2028, achieving our specific medal goals. In terms of what I want to talk about today, though, and Ian has alluded to this already, I am going to spend a little bit of time talking about my experience in an applied setting. So that's with Swim Ireland. And then the second part of the presentation will be about a 4-year PhD program. So I'm fortunate to be co-supervising a current PhD student based in PES, so Lorna Barry. And a lot of her work is centered around athlete monitoring. So I'll give some practical insights based on her work to date. And it becomes really useful and important because some of the work that Lorna has done is the most up-to-date information that we have around athlete monitoring. From an applied setting, I'll quickly go through the different type of metrics that we measured, how they were measured in terms of were they daily, periodic, or specific purpose. And then I'll spend a little bit of time discussing a specific purpose project that we ran towards the tail end of 2018, leading into 2019. And that was the National Starts and Relay Takeovers project. But I'll touch on that in a little bit more detail over the subsequent slides. In terms of setting out how we went about monitoring within Swim Ireland, and this is something that I try to keep in mind whenever we were designing any sort of intervention, be it a daily monitoring system, a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, or whenever we decided something needed to be monitored, trying to set out a set of principles that would ultimately guide how we do it, but more importantly, why we do it. And this paper that was published, I think it was 2020 at this stage, so it's by Paul Gamble and colleagues. And they ultimately lay out the whole idea of being data-driven. And I think we exist in sport at this moment in time where we can measure so much, and sometimes we end up measuring quite a lot. And there is the tendency to fall into, we'll measure it because we can, as opposed to because we need to. And then aside to that, you also have this idea of the data are showing me this, so therefore I have to blindly go down that avenue. And there's a sentence in this particular paper, and I've linked the DOIs to any of the papers that I mentioned within this presentation, so I'm happy to share the slides afterwards. And the quote says, "The world cannot be understood without numbers, and it cannot be understood with numbers alone." And that to me became really important whenever we were setting out to monitor anything with our swimmers and divers. And to me, it spoke to being data-driven versus data-informed. We always try to be data-informed, because ultimately we wanted the data that we collected to offer us insights. And insights are things that people didn't know before or couldn't easily see. And then once we had those insights, we were then able to act on them. So we had some data to back up maybe what it is we thought or what it is was potentially happening. And then we're able to layer that with context. The context could come from the athletes themselves, could come from the coaching and support staff, or any part of the wider system, so that we ended up with monitoring something that we knew that was going to be impactful, but probably more importantly, that we were able to design an intervention to act on the data that we had collected. So what it looked like for us in Swim Ireland, and I've just segmented these out into 3 broad areas. We had daily monitoring, periodic monitoring, and then specific purpose monitoring. And the daily monitoring is probably not too surprising to the vast majority of you. A lot of the metrics we collected on a daily basis are quite common metrics that will be collected across a number of sports and a number of programs. They were related specifically to training metrics, so we had training load, swim volume. Some of them were related to wellness, mood, willingness to train, muscle soreness, related to sleep in terms of quality and duration, and then whether an athlete has an injury or an illness. And what was really useful for us for the daily monitoring was this ability to be quite adaptable and flexible. And this was really prominent during COVID-19 because we were able to embed any COVID screening questions within our daily system. When I first started with Swim Ireland, we were using a monitoring system called HRV4, which, as the name suggests, centered around heart rate variability. But a year and a half in, we decided to change and we signed a contract with Kitman Labs. And that really allowed us to maybe have a little bit more control over specific types of questions that we were able to ask for our daily monitoring. The other reason, or one of the other reasons why we changed, is HRV is a very, very useful metric. And in Swim Ireland, we ran a semi-centralized system. So we had 2 national centres at the time, which housed athletes, and then there were full-time staff associated with those particular centres. However, once we went outside of the centralized system, we are heavily reliant on club coaches, and club coaches play such an important role because a lot of our key athletes are not part of centres. Some of them are based within their daily training environment in their club program. So therefore, trying to have coaches who in some capacity are volunteers or they're also working another full-time job, trying to decipher something like heart rate variability became a little bit more difficult. So we tried to streamline the process and make it a little bit more simple so that it catered for all coaches, but also it meant that the athletes themselves were able to interpret some of their metrics and some of their scores that they were giving on a daily or a weekly basis. In terms of the periodic monitoring, so these are things that we did usually every 4 to 6 weeks, with the exception of the third one on the list, which was the weekly aerobic check. So we did the weekly aerobic check every Monday morning. Athletes swam 4x100 meters freestyle, where they just descended in terms of effort through the 4x100s. And what that gave us is a baseline value over time. And it became really useful whenever we went on camp, whenever we went to altitude, and whenever we went overseas for racing, because we'd have a baseline value as to what it should be on any given week. And therefore, when we traveled, we could then potentially see any effects of travel in terms of residual fatigue on the values that we got from the weekly aerobic check. The other metrics, a little bit more straightforward. We ran an Albrecht model while I was with Swim Ireland. So that gave us measures of aerobic and anaerobic capacity. Usually every 4 to 6 weeks, we ran that test. And the key outcome from those metrics were training paces. So we got training paces for every athlete, which allowed things to be individualized. And every 4 to 6 weeks, we were able to reset and then write the next block of that particular program. The beauty of running the Albrecht model for us was that if we were going wrong, we were only ever going to go wrong for 4 to 6 weeks. And on the grand scheme of things of a 4-year cycle, we were happy enough that if a certain value was off for whatever reason, that we were quickly able to replicate or to quickly able to correct it when we tested the athlete again. The other probably really important ones that came from periodic monitoring were swim performances. So they're the 2 at the bottom. One was the race itself, because it gave us a very objective measure, which was the time. And then we could add context as to where the athlete sat in the cycle, how that racing performance was measuring up. And then the other one was centered around video analysis. So we broke down a lot of our races, and then we were able to look at a lot of the objective measures of a race. So we could break it into its individual components. And then you could have things like stroke rate, stroke length, speed. But even if you broke the race down further, so you could then look at the start phase, which would have block time, flight time, breakout time. We're able to break them down as much as we needed, depending on the athlete in question. And then the final monitoring that we did was based around specific purpose. And these were usually bigger projects that we ultimately did to allow us to answer a specific question or to give us some really detailed insights into something maybe that we were planning to do at a later point in time. I will talk about the National Starts and Relay Takeovers project next, but the other one that was really useful for us is the third one on that list. It was the Long Haul Transmeridian Travel Project. So like I said in one of the earlier slides, we went to the World Championships in Guangzhou in 2019, and we ultimately used that as a dry run for traveling to Tokyo for the Olympic Games the following year. And it gave us some, really, really good insights into how athletes actually responded to long haul travel. The general rule of thumb is for every time zone you cross, the athlete needs about a day in order to start to acclimatize to their new time zone. So we crossed 8 time zones traveling to Guangzhou. So therefore, within 8 to 10 days, our athletes should have been over any residual effects of long haul travel. And what became really interesting for us is that we collected perceptions of jet lag, we had sleep monitoring, but we also had saliva markers to look at immune function. In addition to that, we also had a performance test, which was the weekly aerobic check. And by the time we got to days 8, 9, and 10, the vast majority of those metrics had returned to baseline. So sleep values had returned to normal, the performance checks, so the weekly aerobic check, had returned to normal, and the saliva markers for immune function were showing nothing for us to worry about. But the really interesting one was that it was the athlete's perception of fatigue associated with long haul travel. So we had athletes who on days 12 and 13 were still reporting that they felt jet lag. And that's quite an interesting concept because we couldn't tell the athletes to feel something else because it's very much an individual perception. And we factor that into our travel strategy then for Tokyo. Now, as it happened, the games obviously got shifted by a year, so that travel plan and strategy had to change anyway. But it gave us some really good insights for future travel to that side of the world. For example, World Championships next year are going to be held in Japan. So that information already exists and can be implemented into a travel strategy. So when we're looking at specific purpose monitoring, just going to spend a little bit of time on our national starts and relay takeovers project. And this ultimately came about because of 2 reasons. One was a discussion between coaches around, is there any reason why our skills can't be as good as anyone else in the world? And if you look at swimmers who qualify for the Olympic Games from an Irish perspective, we're never that much underneath the qualifying standard. And that's just a reflection of where we sit in the swimming world. However, if we can improve certain aspects of the race without actually improving an athlete's ability to swim faster, then you start to maybe get more people across that threshold where they'll go from just missing out on qualification to ultimately qualifying. And then the second reason, or the second reason how this project came about is we were at the European Championships in 2018. This is footage from the semi-final of the men's 100 breaststroke. The Irish athlete is in lane 7, so blue racing suit and a black hat. And I'm just going to play the video. I don't think it actually needs too much in terms of commentary or opinion because it becomes very evident from watching this why we decided some sort of intervention was needed. So it's very, very, very evident that we're losing quite a lot of distance on the start. And over a race that is 2 lengths of a 50-meter pool, that it's ultimately done in 60 seconds or less. If you're already giving away anywhere from 1 meter to 1.5 meters just off the first 12 to 15 meters, it's very unlikely that you're going to catch up enough because the other athletes are at a caliber where they're not going to slow down enough for you to make up 1.5 meters to 2 meters. So those 2 things combined are ability to have an impact in terms of improving overall skills, but also then after seeing in real time an area that we could definitely improve through a very pointed and specific project. So how this project actually worked, it was quite a large collaboration. So it was between Swim Ireland, then the Sport Ireland Institute, and then the Sport Northern Ireland Sports Institute. So you ultimately had 3 entities involved. It was open to all of our national squad swimmers at the time. So off the top of my head, that was 34 swimmers. And it involved 3 camera setups. So one on the left-hand side, one on the right-hand side to view the start position, and then one underwater where we could look at the depth an athlete is reaching as they actually enter the water. We had 3 different testing days, which were separated anywhere between 6 and 8 weeks. And the reason we went for 6 to 8 weeks is 1, it allowed us to actually get all the information and disseminate that to the relevant coaches, but also it allowed coaches to design a specific intervention based on the information that they were seeing. And we were quite conscious that some of the athletes who are not housed within the performance centers, that they may never have got this amount of detail before. And there was a little bit of, we'll measure a lot of things. And it maybe almost speaks against some of my previous points around what we should monitor and how. But because some of the athletes had never received this amount of feedback for their start, we tried to keep it quite broad at the start so that the coaches and support staff working with those athletes were then able to look at the footage, at the breakdowns, and at the metrics we collected in order for them to decide what the best intervention was for them to bring about change in the start. They also then had access to individuals like myself, who were obviously full-time employees within Swim Ireland, but then also our physical prep lead, performance analyst, so they could start to ask questions around how can we take this information and then actually implement it into an intervention that brings about sustained change for that athlete. So this is the type of feedback that the athlete and the coach ultimately got. And then the emphasis was on them to decide what is it that you think you should change and then how you go about changing it. And I've just put the word feedback in there because ultimately that's what this started out as. It was a project to give feedback on a very specific part of the race, which then could be used for the coach and the athlete and the support staff to bring about an intervention in order to change a particular aspect of that athlete's start, with the end result hopefully being an improvement in overall performance. So we had, like I said, we had 3 testing days, and they probably occurred over a 3 to 4 month period. So it is quite a relatively short duration, but it was quite focused in terms of what we were looking at, and the metrics and the information that was being given back to the individuals. And just taking the athlete who raced at Europeans. So based on the discussions we had with the national head coach, we identified 3 areas that we thought would help improve this athlete's start. One was the set position on the block. The second one was how they leave the block. And then the third one was peak depth. And the reason we picked those 3 things is we felt that they were all interlinked on a chain. So by changing the set position, either increasing or decreasing the foot angle, we then will be able to potentially change how much they're engaging their hamstring, which has a knock-on effect of their ability to generate force as they leave the block. The second one was the leg split when they were in the air, because this will have a knock-on effect of their body position in the air, which will be linked to resistance, but also the angle at which they then enter the water. The steeper the angle, the more likely that they're going to go deeper. Deeper they go on the start, then they have to quite abruptly and quickly change the angle that they're trying to then break out at. So you end up losing speed. So you spend more time traveling down rather than traveling out. And then ultimately, by changing that position, we're ultimately, ideally anyway, going to change the peak depth that the athlete reaches. There is a certain amount of depth that we want, and that's very individual to each athlete. But we want them to be able to carry as much speed as possible from leaving the block through the flight phase into the water, and then maintaining that speed for as long as possible before they then take their breakout stroke. So what it looked like between days 1 and day 3 for this particular athlete, so all the metrics we identified, we were able to bring about a change in them. Time to 25 got quicker. The set position, we reduced the back foot knee angle by almost 3 degrees. The angle of their leg split as they left the block, we decreased that by just over 5 degrees. And then in terms of peak depth, we decreased that by 0.3 of a meter. So the absolute difference is on the right, and then the relative or percentage difference, is on the right, and the absolute difference is on the left. Now, we didn't set out to specifically change it by those amounts. What we really did was we wanted to increase the athlete's awareness around how they felt on the block. So whether they could feel if their hips were higher or lower, which would change the knee angle, which would then change the feeling they have in terms of hamstring engagement. So the absolute numbers aren't necessarily important, but what is important is how the athlete then went about to set themselves up on the block, because we do a lot of starts in swimming. Every race obviously starts with it, but in a daily training environment, you do a number of starts throughout each session. So the number of starts you do over a week ends up being quite large. If you're doing that over a 4-month period, if you're then changing how you set up on the block in each one of those, you start to get a really good insight into actually which position suits you best. And then over time, you'll start to see by setting up in a particular way, we're then able to have a much more efficient and ideally quicker start, which leads into an overall improved performance. So this is all well and good when we're doing specific testing days, where there's no pressure from a racing perspective, and we can say day 1, these were the particular metrics, day 2, these were the metrics. So we can say then the start has improved from a training perspective. What does it look like then in the actual arena? So we were fortunate that a year after the Europeans, we had the World Championships. So this time it's the same athlete. It's the heats of the 100-meter breaststroke. The athlete is in lane 8, so blue racing suit again, and a black hat. So I'll just play the video through. So even though the angle of the footage is a little bit different, it's taken from the opposite side, because he's a little bit further out, we actually can't see the middle lanes as much. But just from watching that video, it does look like the start is faster. And if nothing else, it looks like he's not coming up behind his particular competitors. You could argue that it's a semi-final versus a heat. However, the semi-final at European level is probably akin to the heats level at a World Championships. Because in that particular World Championships, the Irish athlete was first reserve, but they were also the first athlete at that moment in time anyway to swim sub 60 in the heats of the 100-meter breaststroke and not get into a semi-final. Whereas to get into the semi-final of Europeans in 2018, you were able to swim 60.2 or 60.3. So you could argue that the level of the athlete is equal. And it does look like he's coming up at least on par, if not better, than some of the athletes. So ultimately, it looks faster, but then we wanted to see, well, actually, what does the information tell us about whether it was faster or not? So then this is where the specific purpose monitoring leads back into periodic monitoring, that whole idea of swim performance based on video analysis. And at the time with Swim Ireland, we had a partnership through the Sport Ireland Institute with SAS, who are a data analytics company. And they had created this cloud-based platform for us where we could house all of our race data or race breakdowns, but also then we could have a comparative analysis between our swimmers and the 3 best performances of any swimmer that was contained within the system. And the way it worked is we were able to, like I said earlier, we're able to break the race down into all its individual components. So just looking at the start, so these actually are the athletes' 3 fastest times. So we're comparing the semi-final to the heat. So the 2 values are the 2 columns highlighted in red. For those particular components of block time, flight time, and break time, and bear in mind the semi-final performance was the athlete's best performance to date. However, it's very evident that they didn't have the best start in comparison to everyone else. World Championships a year later, we can see that the metrics have all moved in the direction that we would want them to move. They're off the block quicker. They're able to have a longer flight time, which speaks to them potentially having a better body position, but also then actually achieving more distance in their start. And that distance in the start has a huge knock-on effect on the angle that they enter the water. And by entering the water at a more favorable angle, you're then potentially reducing the depth that you reach while in the underwater phase, but the most important aspect being you're carrying more speed based on your body position. So the metrics move the way we wanted them to move. Another useful component we had within that cloud-based system was this deficit analysis. And the 3 lines in the graph here, they all indicate the athlete's 3 best performances. So the red line are the performance, is the performance from the World Championships. The orange is from Europeans, the semi-final performance area, and then the bluey green is the heats from the European Championships. I'm just going to highlight this first part of it, and you can see the red line sits beneath the orange and the blue for the block time, time to 15, time to 25. So we were reasonably confident then that based on the intervention that we ran, which was ultimately based on the information that we collected and monitored from the START project, we're able to bring about a very specific change in that athlete's behavior in terms of how they actually set up for their start, ultimately then how they execute. that start. And all that is really good. But possibly the most important outcome is the athletes swam their qualifying time for Tokyo at that particular meet. And it's not important in terms of we're only concerned with the result and the process doesn't matter, because we still very much focus on the process. What was really important for us is that it ultimately allowed the athlete to buy in. So by spending time focusing on this specific area that we had identified as a staff, the athlete then starts to trust. And it's a funny one, because you might think that high performance sport and high performance athletes, of course, they're going to trust the coach. But there's still always that hesitancy, particularly in a sport like swimming, because it is a very individual sport. When you get to the actual race, you're the only one on the block. You don't have a team around you per se, an individual athlete in an individual sport. So getting that buy-in from the athlete is critical. And if nothing else, they will then trust the process that the coach and the support staff are trying to implement. And when it comes to us maybe bringing about another change with that athlete, they're more likely to buy in and trust us, because all change is difficult. Athletes are very much creatures of routine and habit. So if we're trying to change something that they've done a specific way all of the time, then it becomes quite difficult for them, because it feels strange and it feels unusual. But them trusting the coach and then ultimately trusting the process means that the end outcome could and hopefully should be better. Just for the next 10 to 15 minutes or so, I just want to talk about Lorna Barry's 4-year PhD program. So Lorna just recently finished writing up her thesis, and she's currently preparing to defend her thesis for her Viva next month. So this was a partnership between the IRC, which is the Irish Research Council, Swim Ireland, and then UL as well. And ultimately, it's centered around this idea of training load and its relationship to injury, illness, and pain in competitive swimmers. So there were multiple components to Lorna's program of work. The first one was identifying this whole research practice gap. So how this came about is, first part of Lorna's PhD was centered around a systematic review. So taking the literature that's currently there and seeing what actually exists in terms of a relationship between training load, pain, injury, and illness. Second to that then, there were 2 surveys carried out. And these surveys were extremely insightful. And I can be slightly biased by saying that, because we surveyed coaches and practitioners around 2 things. One, training load practices, so how they go about monitoring training load, and possibly more importantly is how, what, and why not. The second survey then went to practitioners, and there was this whole idea around injury surveillance. So the 2 things do go somewhat hand in hand. But what we actually found, taking these 2 things together, that there was this research practice gap. And what I mean by that is that some of the things that maybe are appearing in research, when we actually went to the coalface and we asked coaches, practitioners, what it is they're doing, what they say they're doing sometimes doesn't necessarily mirror up with what has currently been done within the research. And some of the key things that we took from these 3 publications combined. So based on the systematic review, there was this whole premise came that internal training load monitoring should be included in competitive swimming. But when we went to coaches and practitioners and we asked them what their training load monitoring practices are, more than 80% said that they were using session RPE and then ultimately calculating training load based on RPE times duration. So those 2 things didn't necessarily mirror up. The second one was standardizing definitions around pain, injury, and illness. So there are a number of definitions, and I put research and a question mark in brackets after that statement, and I'll come back to that in a second. But when we went to the practitioners, the majority who responded said that they were either using the FINA or the IOC definitions of injury. And just as a point of clarity, FINA is now known as World Aquatics, but for all of Lorna's work, it's referred to as FINA because that's the entity it was when she started. Other responders used a combination of the 2. There was an AIS, so an Australian Institute of Sport definition being used by one, and then there was one person who had come up with their own bespoke definition. And this really probably feeds into the final point on that insights table is that when we were asking them why they actually engage in injury surveillance and training load monitoring, research was not identified as a primary reason at all. So the whole idea that we need to standardize definitions maybe doesn't mirror up, because if research is the priority, then yes, we would need a standard definition that all programs are adopting. However, if we're looking for a sport-specific definition, or possibly more importantly, in any one individual program, as long as they have a definition and they adhere to that definition, then it doesn't necessarily become an issue. And this is ultimately reflected in the reasons as to why coaches and practitioners monitor training load. One is for an athlete's response to training, self-explanatory, and then ultimately to improve performance. On the injury surveillance side of things, one of the interesting parts to come from why they would actually have injury surveillance seem to center around for insurance reasons. And that's not something that we had maybe considered being a primary focus, but looking at some of the programs that were involved in the survey, some of them are quite large international setups, you can start to see then why insurance reasons becomes quite prominent for them. And then the final thing that came from these three publications was that longitudinal prospective studies should use session RPE. And this then filtered into the final part of Lorna's PhD program, which was a 2-year longitudinal study. And I'll come to that in a second. The second part of her program was around designing, implementing, and then ultimately evaluating a monitoring system. I had said a few slides ago that Swim Ireland had a contract with Kitman Labs. So ultimately, Kitman Labs was the tool that we used when it came to designing the particular monitoring system that we were using. So it was an integrated monitoring system. There were two arms to it. One was the athlete reported data, and then the second one was the practitioner reported data. I'm not going to talk through all of the things highlighted in that figure, but ultimately on the athlete side, we looked at well-being data and then training load data. So some things related to energy, mood, wellness, etc. And then on the training load side of things, RPE, session duration, session volume. For the practitioner reported data, it was broken down into injury and illness. And the subsequent categories underneath those relate to the type of injury, whether it required medical attention or not, whether there was time loss or non-time loss, and then the mode of onset and the circumstances of the injury as well. Where swimming probably differs to a lot of sports is because it's a non-load bearing sport, there isn't a huge amount of time loss. So even if an athlete has a particular injury, illness being a little bit different, but for the vast majority of injuries, training is able to be modified in order for the athlete to continue training. And there is a case that a lot of athletes train with persistent injury, and some of them are not overly serious or they're relatively acute. But the fact that we don't lose that much time in swimming due to injury, in fact, the vast majority of it ends up being non-time loss injuries. So off the back of implementing that particular training or monitoring system, we then set about how do we evaluate it to make it better for the second year. This was done through focus groups and surveys. And I've just highlighted some of the main themes that emerged from those focus groups. I'm just conscious of time and the few bits I want to get through. So I'm not going to talk through all of those individually, but possibly the two that were most important. One is maintaining data integrity, so it's accuracy and compliance. So is the athlete ultimately reporting accurately all of their particular self-reported data? Is the practitioner also recording and reporting the data accurately as well? And then compliance was an interesting one, because in an ideal world, everyone fills in everything all of the time, but we know that's not the case. There always is going to be a missing data point along the way. Resources will have a huge impact, but also the level of the athlete. And the level of the athlete was quite insightful for us because it links into the following point around the coach's influence. So if the coach is data orientated, therefore they're more likely to engage in the system, then the athletes pick up on that very quickly, and therefore they are more compliant. Whereas if a coach is less interested, doesn't buy in as much, then the compliance starts to drop. The other one that came around the coach's influence on the process was that some coaches will interact with certain metrics that they deem to be important, regardless of whether it's scientifically validated or not. So certain metrics around RPE, there's plenty of literature to support their usefulness and how valid they are. But then one that we found was an athlete's willingness to train. And that was something that was put in based on the request of the coach. There isn't any evidence that we're aware of that that's a metric that you should include in a monitoring system. However, the coach looked at that every morning. It was the first metric that they looked at. And from that, then they were able to gauge whether an athlete was in the right state of mind to train or not. And over a long enough period of time, they were able to use that in order to alter any training that was potentially planned. And it was just done on a 1 to 5 scale. 1 being I'm not very motivated to train per se, and then 5 being I'm extremely willing to train. So that for us maybe highlighted that sometimes the research practice gap exists. Even when we have a lot of validated metrics, there are still some that don't have the research behind them, but are very, very useful in an applied setting. And then just the final few slides on the 2-year longitudinal study. So this finished back in September of 2022. It had ran since September 2020. So 104 weeks worth of data collection. The 2 graphs here just represent what it actually looked like. The graph on the top is just the weekly training volume in the pool. And then the second axis is the number of injuries or illnesses over that period of time. On this particular one, if memory serves me right, red relates to illness and yellow relates to injury. And then the graph on the bottom, it's essentially the same, except instead of weekly volume, we have weekly total load instead. You will see that there is one huge spike in red around weeks 69 to 71, and that's when the entire squad decided to get COVID. But other than that, what becomes really apparent is that it's relatively stable throughout. The volume itself and the training load has a few peaks in it, but on the grand scheme of things, the mean values are relatively stable and consistent in comparison to other programs that exist in the world. A little bit of context into terms of what was involved in this study. So we had 32 data sets from athletes. So some athletes provided 104 weeks worth of data, so seasons 1 and 2. Others, depending on when they left the program or entered the program, have either 1 season, so be it the first season or the second season. Like I said, it was 104 weeks long. The standard of the athletes, so 2 were world class, 11 were elite or international class. So international class would be anything from European standard up at senior level. World class would be medalists at international competitions. And then 19 were either highly trained or national level. So the vast majority of those in the highly trained national level will be athletes who are on a national squad. So it's almost a case the bottom tier were those on a national squad, the next tier were those who competed internationally, and then the final one was those who had medaled at an international competition. So the caliber of athlete is quite high. In terms of what the actual program looked like, max volume of 63 kilometers per week, but the mean is probably a little bit more important here, 34 kilometers with a standard deviation of 13 kilometers. In terms of total training load, so that's pool and gym combined, racing is also factored in there for when the athletes raced. It's arbitrary units, so the maximum was 12,280, but the mean again was 3,838. So on the grand scheme of things, when you look at other programs internationally, mean volume and mean training load are relatively conservative. And then just how frequently we had injuries and illness. So those that required medical attention, over 104 weeks, we had 60 medical attention illnesses, and 58 medical attention injuries. Again, that's not a huge amount considering we had 32 athletes over 104 weeks. And there were some athletes who had no injuries or no illnesses at all during that particular period. One thing that was really interesting for us was that there was one athlete who had 262 consecutive days of athlete monitoring. So it was from the start of the season in 2020, which would have been the end of August. Said athlete competed at the Paralympic Games in 2021. They didn't miss a single day of athlete of monitoring throughout that period, so 362 days. I'm pretty confident that the only thing that I do for 362 days would be sleeping and eating. So for an athlete to not miss any of those, where that includes days off, downtime from Christmas or other holiday periods, shows just how invested they were within the actual monitoring system. And then just finally, some of the results that we have. So the analyses are still ongoing, but ultimately what we found was that when we looked at the relationship between training load and injury and illness, for the vast majority of the metrics we included around injury and illness, so be it time loss, non-time loss, is it an injury, is it an illness, is it based on total volume, is it based on training load, is it based on acute chronic workload ratio? Pretty much for the vast majority of those metrics, the odds of an injury and illness, there was no association. So the vast majority of the odds ratios were at 1 or close to 1. There were 2 that actually had an odds ratio that were statistically significant. So that was time loss illness and weekly total training load, and then time loss illness and weekly pool volume. While they were statistically significant, their effect size was really, really small. So from a practical perspective, how much of a bearing they would have had is questionable. And what it really showed us is that because these athletes were in a centralized program, that a centralized program that's well structured, well monitored, it does appear to reduce the likelihood of training load related injuries and illness. So even though we still had them, 60 illnesses, 58 injuries, something else is contributing towards those. Case in point being when we had a large outbreak of COVID-19 within the center, that's not something that we can account for from a training load perspective. But it does give confidence that if you are able to structure your program in the right way, then you're ultimately able to reduce any likelihood of injury and illness occurring through training load metrics anyway. Everything else that happens outside the pool, that's a little bit harder to account for. And then just finally, just some very quick take-home points. I'll rattle through these quickly just so that we have some sort of time for questions. There is a lot you can monitor, but that does not mean you have to. So therefore, pick what is relevant and important to your cohort of athletes and then do that really well. You need to have an element of subjectivity and objectivity when it comes to monitoring. The coach I worked with a number of years ago always described coaching as an art and a science. And I think that fits quite well into trying to balance up being data-driven versus data-informed. You can have the numbers, but you also then need the context, be it from the athlete, the coach, or the support staff. Different athletes require different feedback. Some athletes want a lot of feedback, and in some cases that's good if they're a little bit older and more experienced. However, some of the younger athletes want all of the feedback, but they potentially don't have the maturity or the personality to actually look at that in its entirety and then digest it. So how you feedback, when you feedback, and ultimately what you feedback becomes important. And it all comes back to knowing your athletes and what it is that they need and want. Monitoring can sometimes be used for something as simple as starting a conversation with an athlete, because an athlete will indirectly, through filling in the various metrics, hint that if something isn't right. And sometimes athletes may not want to tell the coach directly that something is up. However, if the coaches and the support staff are looking at those metrics quite frequently, and they see that something starts to deviate from their baseline values or that something is trending in the wrong direction, then the coach is able to instigate that conversation with the athlete. Buy-in is key, and without it, it becomes very, very difficult to implement any sort of monitoring system. You want good, consistent monitoring, but that does require input from all parties. So that's the coach, the athlete, support staff, the entire system around that high performance program. Everyone needs to be invested in the importance of monitoring so that it can be done really well. One of the more, from a personal perspective, I just find this really interesting that a coach may find some metrics more useful than others, even if they're not scientifically proven. And that comes back to the whole willingness to train. So we had included mood as one of the actual wellness metrics we wanted to be in the monitoring system. We kept that in, and then the coach wanted willingness to train. And it seems so simple that if you were to ask any particular athlete or individual, are you willing to train today? That they would tell you yes or no. But the coach put a lot of emphasis on it, and it ultimately ended up being the metric he would look at first before deciding then how to proceed for the rest of that particular session and or day. And then just the final slide. So some of you may have seen this on Twitter the other day. So it's by Sean McLaren. I don't know him personally, but I just thought it was quite a headline that caught my attention. And this whole idea of training load monitoring is like wearing a seatbelt. what I picked out from his main quotes is that if used properly. And I think that probably speaks to any sort of metric or monitoring system that you're trying to implement. If it's done really well, if you've implemented it to the best of your ability, you have athlete buy-in. Therefore, it can be used properly. Whereas it comes back to if there's a lack of compliance and a lack of accuracy, then any of the conclusions that you draw from that may be inaccurate. So whatever metric it is you're deciding to monitor, and if you can implement that in a way that you know it can be accurately collected, you know the athlete is going to fill it in as best they can, then you can start to use that metric to your advantage. And that's everything from me. Ian, if we have any questions, I'm more than happy to take them.
Super. Thank you, Cormac.